The next session, cross-sector information sharing and support planning, preparedness, and response. Lessons from 2021. Oh, and you folks in California have learned a lot of lessons this year, haven't you? We have two terrific panelists here to share their experiences. Monica Stoffel, Executive Director, California Resiliency Alliance, and we have Abby Browning, Chief of Private Sector and NGO Coordination for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. And Ms. Browning's role also includes cross-sector exercises for hurricane season preparation. With that said, why don't I go ahead and turn it over to you folks?
Perfect. Thank you, Del. And we will share, and I will get the screen up.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think that was a bit of a, I don't necessarily know if it was a typo or a mistake in the cut and paste, but it's not hurricane prep. That's one of the things that we don't have here in California. Thank you. But it's fire season prep.
Sorry about that. I was wondering about that. Maybe it's the tsunami, hurricane. Oh, it's all the same. There's a lot of water involved.
There's a lot of water. Yes, absolutely. And I do, we do work very closely with our partners on the East Coast because when the hurricane comes in, it affects all of us. So there's that.
Thank you for the clarification, Abby. My bad. Over to you.
Well, thank you. Then we will get started and jump right on in. I do want to say thank you to everybody who is on to the call today and participating in this session and the conference as a whole. There's a lot of really good information sharing that's happening. And the focus of what Abby and I are talking about today is really reflecting back on last year and what are some of the lessons we're taking away from cross-sector information sharing those with you, and then looking into the future as well. And one of the things we wanted to start with was quickly looking back at the 4 key takeaways that we ended last year's presentation on, which was a reflection on 2020. And so one of the takeaways that I had was really how 2020 was a year of the asterisk. It's this year where everything kind of pivoted and went a whole new direction. And a lot of the data and trends that we had suddenly needed to be divided into this, well, that was pre-pandemic and now we're pandemic. And you can't really compare the two anymore because of how the pandemic affected so many trends. And the other key point that I really had was about stepping back to reassess regularly. And that is part of what today's presentation is on. And also something that I think as we really are invested in this ongoing response, dealing with concurrent hazards is something that can be hard to do, to take that step back and really reassess of where are we, what's going on, because it's so easy to become tunnel visioned. And so those were my 2 big takeaways from last year's presentation. Abby, I will hand it over to you to summarize yours and move us on into this year's.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Monica. And so as you can read here on the screen, it's communication evolves. It's not static. We learned very quickly that we needed to find different ways to communicate with each other because 2020 brought us such wonderful new challenges to look at. We couldn't rely on just sending out reports every day because the reports, they needed to go faster. We needed to have a different method. We needed to be able to text with someone. We needed to be able to call someone. We needed to be able to give them a snapshot, some pictures. We just needed to change our way of thinking on how we communicate and what we communicate with our partners. And then moving on to the last one is trusted, established partnerships are key. It is no place to be exchanging business cards the day after the disaster happens. We need to know who we're talking to. I need to know that I can pick up the phone and call somebody that works for Pacific Gas and Electric and say, hey, what the heck is going on? I got to figure this out. We got to work through this. It was also very helpful because 2020 we had a lot of huge eye-opening firsts. When we shut down the state of California, as someone that has a background in economics, it scared the life out of me. And so I was able to call some of my partners and say, oh my God, here it comes, get ready for it. And we were able to work through things together. And because I had that established partnership and those relationships, I was able to be a little bit more raw and a bit more real with them instead of trying to be as diplomatic as I could be, because things were moving at an enormous pace that I just needed assistance. And that's what I was able to get from my partners. So what we wanted to talk this time is, how are things changing? When we looked at 2020 last year, we thought that was going to be a blip. Like Monica mentioned, the year of the asterisk. What we're learning quickly is that it's not really a blip. It's changing the way that we're doing things. Things are evolving. We have to adapt. And so what I did here with these pictures is just kind of put it into place that this is something that we've always done. We've always evolved and adapt to how we respond to disasters based on what's available to us, what resources we have. There's the horse-drawn carriage with the bucket brigade going down the road. But then we have the tried true fire engines that you see in every municipality in the United States. But now our wildfires are so big, we have these massive airplanes that we can put retardant on and drop things and create barriers around the fire to stop it from spreading, things like that. And so we have been adapting when it comes to the material items that we utilize. And so now it is time for us to evolve and adapt regarding how we respond. I mean, it's going to take more than just a fire truck. It's going to take more communication. It's going to take those partnerships to the next level. So in reflections on how the government responds, we have been very good in California at addressing anticipated disasters. We have our catastrophic earthquake plans that we spend a lot of time on. We have these massive fires, and we have an amazing cadre of firefighters that come to the rescue every year without fail to stop these fires. We're quite good at it. These are the things that we practice over and over again, and we're ready for it, even when they come at extreme situations. These are 3 examples of things that happened in 2021 that we were able to respond to, even though they were on a much larger scale. In Northern California, we had severe rainstorms, something called a bomb cyclone. Sometimes I honestly think that the Weather Service is making up these names as they go. But let me tell you, it did the job. It scared us all. And so we were trying to be prepared for it. In that storm, 10 inches of rain fell in 24 hours. And that was about 70% of our previous annual rainfall. And so the fact that it just dumped the water constantly, we had to down trees, we had flooded areas, and we had to deal with our burn scars that had some debris movement. But all of that was something that we expected. And it was a lot of water, a lot more than what we're used to. But we're like, okay, we know what to do. Massive wildfires. We had the Dixie Fire, which was very close to being 1 million acres alone. That was not a complex fire. That was not 3 fires joined together like we've had in the past. This was one massive fire, and it was actually 963,309 acres. that is roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island. So one fire, and it burned for a very, very long time. But during that time, we also had other fires that were burning: the river fire, Caldor fire. The Caldor fire went up the mountain and was getting ready to cross over into our sister state of Nevada. And we had to evacuate South Lake Tahoe. It's a large metropolitan area. And the challenges with that came from cross-state involvement. California has a very robust emergency services system. And up until this point, Nevada has not had to have as much. They do have, don't get me wrong, but they do not have nearly as much. And so we were able to work with them on that effort. And then finally, there are man-made events. We had the oil spill. It's not something that we like to do, but we know what to do and we know how to do it. That particular oil spill was about 4.5 miles offshore, and it was about 25,000 gallons that was spilled. It wasn't quite as big as other oil spills, but the location of it and the fact that it covered 763 miles of California's shoreline. Keep in mind, we only have 840 miles total. It shows how it's spread across. And when it happened was peak tourism for our coastal areas. And so there was a lot of attention on there. We lost a lot of economic tourism because of that. And the overall concerns, of course, for the environment. And we had to work with private sector, the federal government, and our local authorities on that. So all of those very big situations, something that we deal with and we had to deal with, but they're all kind of anticipated. They're expected. We have plans in place for fires. We have plans for storms. We practice what's going to happen if there's a man-made event. Those are the kinds of things that we have been doing and that we had to deal with. You're on mute, Monica.
Just realized that. As you're going to see, Abby and I are going to be flipping back and forth throughout the presentation and kind of looking at that trend of kind of that old normal of what the traditional disasters are that we've dealt with in emergency management, business continuity arena, and kind of some reflections on the lessons around information sharing on some of those of what I dealt with throughout the last year. Like with the California wildfires, this concept of we've dealt with them year after year now for several years, and massive wildfires every single year. It's something that the West Coast is kind of every year there's wildfires in the West. And one of the things we often face with that when it becomes something we face so regularly is getting into a rut on that, especially with information sharing. Template is created, fill in the data, hit send, do it again and again and again. And really kind of playing on that concept of what I ended one of the points with from last year's presentation, that taking a step back and that need for continuous improvement on that. And one of the things I really did last year and spent some time focusing on was how can I empower California Resiliency Alliance members somewhat more with the information that's shared. Not just here's the size of the wildfire, here's where it's burning, here's evacuation areas and that, but really looking at how do I empower them to have some foresight, to think things through and give them some data that they might not otherwise think about looking at. And that's where this continuous improvement comes in. One of the changes I made to the wildfire briefs last year was the integration of charts such as what is the energy release component? What is the 10 or 100 hour dry fuel moisture? Those are indicators of, how quickly might this fire spread Granted, wind is going to play a big factor in that, but are the fuel conditions really conducive to explosive fire growth? Or are the moisture levels increasing and going to hamper perhaps some of that explosive growth? Providing that type of data and giving that some empowerment to that, and utilizing events as educational opportunities as well. One of the stories that I did want to share moving over into the atmospheric river storms is this concept of context being lost in translation. Abby shared the story about how we had these massive rainstorms that just dropped a ton of water, and they covered or hit a huge part of the state. And there's now a lot of different entities that share information about emergency management, situational awareness, and really try and push out. One of the things is many of them rely on news media as a primary source of information. And it's not necessarily bad, but sometimes those stories are written in their own way to tell their own story. And if they're taken and put into a different context, they can lose a lot of meaning and inadvertently become misinformation. An example that I wanted to share with this one is about the debris flow risks from all the wildfires that we had in the last couple of years, including last year, that were potentially becoming debris flow risk in this storm. So one of these situation reports pushed out by somebody highlighted the risk of debris flow and listed only 2 wildfires as having risk of debris flow. The reason for that was they pulled it from a news media report, which had cited a National Weather Service person talking about debris flow risk. Well, the National Weather Service person was based in Central California out of the Hanford office. So he obviously mentioned the fires that were of direct relevance to his area of responsibility. Not statewide. We're lucky in California, we have 10 different National Weather Service offices covering our state. So you kind of need to monitor a bunch of different ones. But what happened with this lost in translation is they took that story from the National Weather Service person who was talking about the risk in Central California, his jurisdiction, and put it onto a state level scale and said, here's the 2 fires that have risk from debris flow, forgetting about all the other wildfires because they weren't mentioned by the person. And so there's this high risk of, even in the events that we're used to and deal with regularly, for things to get lost as they go through the information sharing chain and become potentially that misinformation. And the third one that I wanted to highlight was a story around the Colonial Pipeline incident. And while the California Resiliency Alliance focuses on California, I sometimes utilize events and information from outside of the region as educational opportunities for California. So I created this whole brief around fuel infrastructure in California based on the Colonial Pipeline incident, because it was something that was in people's minds. They were already thinking about fuel. Well, what does that mean here in California? So here was this nice brief laid out about fuel infrastructure in California. The surprising thing was realizing how many people who should have known are in positions where they have responsibility of already knowing California's fuel infrastructure didn't know California's fuel infrastructure, didn't know that there is no pipeline connection really between California's refineries and the Colonial Pipeline, that those aren't connected physically. And so we make these assumptions about experts that they have the base knowledge of what all the infrastructure is and how it operates and how it connects. And yet that can be a dangerous assumption because we don't necessarily know how extensive that knowledge is. Is their knowledge based on the local infrastructure? Or is it based on infrastructure in a different region? As Colonial Pipeline highlighted, California's infrastructure and fuel is different than the connections and pipelines and how the refineries move across states, the goods in the Gulf states and the East Coast. So we have to be careful about these assumptions that we make. Kind of moving us from the traditional disasters and emergencies into this new sphere that Abby had mentioned. And one of the things that over the past few decades we've really been doing with all of our systems and infrastructure is we have removed slack from them. We've increased efficiency, which has its benefits, but it removes slack and makes us more vulnerable to things. We've also tied and made more kind of knit together a lot of our systems and infrastructures. And one of the results of this is an expanding realm of the unknown unknowns. With the disasters that we deal with regularly, we kind of have an idea of what are the things that we don't know. But we're now emerging into a world where that sphere of the unknown unknown is growing vastly. And that's an arena where we have high risk of being blindsided. Also, because of these interconnections, disasters are no longer as local as we often traditionally treat them. Consequence management still is fairly local. But when we think about wildfires here in the West Coast, creating air quality incidents on the East Coast, when a wildfire burning down a rail bridge here can cause supply chain issues across the Western US, or the constraints at the port of LA Long Beach impacting supply chain nationally and even internationally. The ripple effects are in ways that we don't necessarily think about in our traditional disaster approach. And so this is where we're now transitioning kind of into that new sphere of emergency management that Abby had mentioned. And looking at kind of some of the things that I went through last year and some of the lessons that I had from that. The first one I want to start with is January 6th and kind of responding to the unexpected in that sense. One of the things that really helped for this was having the reference library that I do. And I was able to go in and pull resources and reports and materials to help build some situational guidance around that. That was not just a highlight of here's what's going on, because again, that was an East Coast event. And I try and stay a little bit more focused on how does this impact and influence California? What's the relevance for California? So having that reference library really allowed me to delve in for an event that was unexpected and have resources at my fingertips. The pandemic response has changed the playing field. One of the big takeaways from that, a lot of the people that we invite to our planning sessions and engage in conversations around are not necessarily the ones who are making the decisions in this new world, where elected officials are becoming much more engaged in emergency response and the decision-making of emergency response. And so really reevaluating how are we not only sharing information, but how are we engaging stakeholders in this process, because the decision-making stakeholders are evolving as well. And then the last point that I wanted to make really was looking at these converging threats and looking beyond. We're in an arena where we're starting to deal more with hybrid threats, where they might not be this one major incident of a wildfire or a terrorist attack, but successive smaller things that chip away and eat and erode infrastructure and creating risk and vulnerabilities in that sense, and needing to look beyond what we traditionally define as disaster and recognizing that these smaller events may be accumulating into something that has larger repercussions. Abby?
There we go. I needed to unmute. And then, before I start into this slide, I just wanted to point out that I'm sure you've noticed by now, Monica and I are talking about similar, if not the same, issues and the same disasters or events. But we're looking at it from much different angles, and what we pull out and what the concern is for us and how we respond and what we need is so different. And that just goes back to why the partnership that Monica and I have is very valuable, because we look at the same event through different lens. And because I am confident and comfortable enough with her, I can call her up and say, this is what I'm seeing, this is what we're doing, what are your thoughts on it? So I can better be prepared to assist the private sector with what they need. And then Monica can do in return, call me and say, what are you guys doing? What's your concern? What are your worries about? So that way she can better communicate that to the private sector, and so they can understand where we're at. Because I think a lot of the biggest problems with any public-private partnership across the board is miscommunication, and not understanding that we're looking at the same problem, but we're seeing totally different things. So having said that, moving into how the government responds for the unexpected, we're starting to do much more than just putting out fires. It's no longer put the wet stuff on the red stuff. It's dealing with, for example, the COVID-19 response. At the beginning of 2021, FEMA and Cal OES was tapped by the federal government and the state government to set up community vaccination clinics, these mass vaccination sites. We set one of them in Oakland at the Oakland Coliseum, and one of them in East Los Angeles at California State University, Los Angeles. And the goal was to reach these underserved communities where the hardest hit for COVID positive rates, as well as COVID deaths. And so to get these people vaccinated. And so we had to set up these massive distribution sites where people would come in and get their shots, and they had their appointments, et cetera. And then we're also doing a PPE distribution. Not only do we use our normal channels with our medical health operational areas, but my office here also hands out PPE to our small business community, our essential services, and our nonprofits to get this PPE out to the general public. We have a lot of mask mandates throughout the state and the counties. And as I'm sure you're all aware, Omicron surge is roaring its ugly head right now. And California is in the middle of it. And the best that we can possibly do is try to protect Californians, or at least give them the opportunity to do this and not have financial barriers. So that's something that you asked me 3 years ago, I would never have thought, but apparently this is what we do now. And so it's added to our mix. I'm doing that right now. We're doing another PPE distribution push. And then, Monica had mentioned the civil unrest in the January 6th event. But you know what really came out of it that was unexpected for us is the distrust in government. I understand it. I have complete empathy for those back and forth, but for someone who is trying to respond to disasters and be a first responder, it's difficult because we're used to, and all of my colleagues are used to being the heroes on the white knights rolling in, and saving the day. And that was not wanted. And so a good example is during the COVID-19 response, when we set up that the vaccination clinics down in East Los Angeles. It's a very large Latino population in East LA, and there is a lot of undocumented people that live in and around that area. And while we wanted to get everyone healthy and vaccinated, And our goal was, we're not checking anything. We just want to get you vaccinated. Don't really care about any of your situation. When you're rolling in and setting up this shop, it's the National Guard. We're pulling in. So you have military vehicles and military dressed people rolling into a very large community that has a massive distrust of government. And so it was a challenge dealing with that. Thankfully, we had pre-existing relationships with several of our community organizations that helped us get that message across and be that trusted messenger for us. And then finally, Monica had mentioned converging problems. I look at it as cascading problems. We're doing something to solve one thing, and then 5 months later, it causes another issue. A perfect example is what happened during our winter storms. As some of you may know, California over the past few years has implemented what we call PSPS. It's the Public Safety Power Shutdowns. Our utilities come through, and they have a complex algorithm. If it's a really bad fire situation, like bad winds, dry brush, etc., they will shut the power down on red flag days. And it is expected in a lot of our rural areas. So what residents and businesses have done is they've gone out and they've upgraded, or they've gotten a generator to get through those, because they only last a couple of days. And so they have that, and they're being very responsible, knowing that this is coming. We'll get ourselves a generator and we'll get through it. A lot of them got propane generators in some of these areas, but they did not upgrade their tank. They're supposed to have an upgraded tank, or they're supposed to have an additional tank, but they did not do that, thinking, oh, it'll be okay. What are the chances? Because I don't use a lot of propane in the summertime. That's when the PSPS happens. It'll be fine. Well, fast forward to December, January of this year, we had this massive winter storm that went through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it caused power outages all over the place. And so people flipped on that propane generator, and their propane supply, which normally would have lasted them a month, only lasted 2 to 3 days. And then there was not enough truck drivers because of the supply chain shortage and the issues with COVID, et cetera, to go out there. I mean, everybody was out of propane at the same time. And so we had those issues. And then trying to explain to our first responders who want to get out there and do as much as they can, you can't just dig at a propane tank. I mean, those things blow up. You need to have the proper personnel that know what they're doing out there doing this. And unfortunately, there's just not that many of them. And so there was a lot of cascading problems, things that we never had encountered before. But while we're doing one thing to solve this problem, we think, okay, this is fine, this is great. And then 5 months down the road, it creates a whole nother problem that we never thought about. So some key takeaways for me for 2021 would be that learning to adapt. Because even though, like I mentioned at the very beginning, we have evolved with how we respond to regular disasters, or our quote unquote normal disasters, we have to adapt everything that we have to respond to whatever hits us. And so we use the National Guard, we use the firefighters, we used our police officers to help us with the COVID-19 response. We used those folks to help us get the distrust of government. Go out there into the community, let them talk to you. No, don't be afraid, try to break down those barriers. And then expect the unexpected, because it's been 2 years now, and it's just different. And we just have to be prepared to deal with anything that comes at us. And it's just like, it really is just like your normal everyday life as an adult going through day to day. So sometimes things happen and you're just going to have to pivot and you're going to have to deal with it. And that's what being an adult is about. I look at that and I compare that to how we do first responders and how we respond to disasters. Sometimes we just have to pivot. Sometimes things get thrown at us that we've never thought would happen, and we're just going to have to deal with it. And we take our lessons learned from our previous disasters or from the plans that we've made, and we have to adjust to fit this unexpected disaster that hits us.
Often our brains, I think, really work in a linear fashion on that. What happened in past disasters is what we used as the basis for what might happen in the future, and kind of that linear progression that today is going to inform us of what's going to happen tomorrow. One of the things that's really come to light, and I think the pandemic has helped us gain a better understanding of what exponential change and growth means and kind of how those curves behave, is this concept and recognition that the complex systems that we're living in today and dealing with, they fail exponentially. They don't fail necessarily on a linear fashion. So it might be something little and they're okay. Little and it's okay. Little and it's okay. Little it's okay. It's still not. But when we think about with pandemic case doubling, 1 going to 2 cases is fine, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, fine. But at a certain point, you hit something where it explodes so rapidly. And taking away that complex systems are in a similar way, where there might be that inflection point, where you're okay and the system can handle it up until that point, and then it's just exponential failure. And also, the second takeaway that I have from last year is really looking out at the horizons. And it's a play on this concept that I ended last year's with, of taking a step back and reflecting. It's taking that step back and looking out into the future of how are the patterns that we're seeing now, how might they evolve? And I added on to this the concept of playing what if. And that is not just, oh, well, what if an earthquake happens? What if a fire happens? But what if the assumptions we're making are wrong? There's flaws in them. What if, a scenario such as January 6th happened, and not looking at how do we respond to it, but maybe what are the factors that led up to it happening on that. And that goes back to, I think, that converging threats and the hybrid threats that I talked about, and kind of that a little bit of a difference from the cascading impact Abby mentioned, is we have these threat actors who are really potentially working on smaller scales, doing, not just with cyber or physical attacks, but using information management, using economics, legal systems, using all sorts of different vectors to create instability, to create vulnerabilities. And so needing to take that step back, look to the horizon, what might those small hybrid threats converge into? What's an end game? And looking at that, playing those what if scenarios on a much broader scale, taking a look at the converging aspects as we experienced several years ago. What if you have a massive wildfire going on and simultaneously you have public safety power shutoff going on? That's a whole different scenario than taking the two events separately. And so really taking that look onto the horizons and exploring the what ifs. So the complex systems fail exponentially, and that looking out are the 2 points I wanted to leave people with. And that really wraps up our presentation today of Abby and my reflection back on the last year. and the takeaways we had on the cross-sector information sharing and kind of looking at the planning, response, preparedness. We want to now open it up to, oh, Abby, go ahead, and then we want to open it up to questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We did have one question that I wanted to reach out until we got to our hard stop here. We're coming close to it. Is what are your thoughts on rapid response systems to extinguish wildfires in their initial stages? According to experts, the time frame for response could be as short as 2 minutes or 15 minutes max. I realize this is high risk technical challenge, but with vision systems out there viewing the forest areas and the advanced tech with drones, would this be worth a try as a consortium initiated with industry, government, universities, and the emergency responders? First of all, thank you for the question. We're always open to more ideas and more thoughts because I'm very aware that we don't know everything. And so happy to discuss, but I will tell you that we do a lot of that. We have access to DoD satellites, a lot of secret squirrel type stuff. I could tell you what kind of coffee you're drinking right now type thing. We watch that very closely. We have pre-positioned assets all throughout the state, and we do cut down. I'd say, I think the number last year was around 3,000 fires that we put out like immediately. The ones that you hear about are the ones that are big, fast, and get out of the way. Really, really hard to capture. And to keep in mind that our state is 104 million acres. And so to have something covering each one of those acres, it's just an unbelievable expense. And when you're government, you have competing priorities, you know, healthcare, education, roads, you know, things like that. So it's a difficult thing, but we do look at new innovation all the time. And so I would welcome any kind of think tank, and I can connect with our leadership over at CAL FIRE and at Wildfire Safety with our natural resources that look at this all the time.
Terrific. Hey, Abby, so this is Dell. We're coming up to a relatively hard stop. We've got a break ahead of us. You know, we want to thank both you and Monica for your insights today. This is obviously, here again, a much larger conversation to be had for the future. And so we look forward to being able to schedule something else and have people join into the conversation. So great insights. And by the way, I am from the great state of California, lived there the first 40 years, been through a lot of those events you talked about, tsunamis, earthquakes, all sorts of fun stuff. And I can tell you this, folks in California, as well as many of my own family members, thank you too, and really appreciate the fact that you're both on point on this. So thank you for your time today. Great presentation.
Well, thank you. And for all of everyone there, I'll put my information in the chat. If you're in California or you work with California, by all means connect, and we can get you plugged in with all the information that you would need. And then if you have ideas, happy to entertain them.
Thank you for having us as presenters, and I will put my contact information in the chat as well. Feel free to reach out, and I look forward to engaging with people further on this topic.
Thank you so much, folks.